The night shift in Tucson starts at 10 and ends when your body gives out. Maya Harlow knew this better than anyone. She had been riding these roads long enough to feel the city change under her wheels. When the sun dropped behind the Rincon Mountains and the desert air finally exhaled its held heat, the streets transformed. The daytime Tucson of office workers and tourists and college kids dissolved into something rawer, quieter, and, in some corners, considerably more dangerous. The couriers who worked the day shift dealt with traffic and impatient customers and the blinding white glare of the Arizona sun. Maya dealt with empty intersections, unmarked addresses, and the particular vulnerability of being a young woman alone on a motorcycle after dark. She had learned to read the world differently after the accident. That was how she always thought of it. The accident, not the crash, not the night everything changed. Just the accident, clinical and contained like a chapter heading in someone else's story. 2 years ago, on a Tuesday in September, her Honda CB500 had hit a patch of diesel spill on Route 9 where the overpass crossed the dry wash at the edge of the city. The bike had gone sideways at 40 miles an hour. She remembered the sound of it, the shriek of metal on asphalt, the strange underwater roar of impact. Those were the last sounds she ever heard clearly. The doctors called it bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, severe to profound. The audiologist had drawn diagrams. Her mother had called from out of state and cried on the phone, or at least that was what Maya assumed from the shapes her face was making in the video call. Maya had sat in the hospital bed looking at the acoustic ceiling tiles and done the math in her head. She was 20 years old, 3 semesters into a nursing program at the University of Arizona, working 2 part-time jobs to keep herself from drowning in tuition debt. And now the world had gone silent. The bills had been something out of a nightmare. $41,000 for the initial hospitalization and surgeries, another $20,000 for rehabilitation, hearing specialists, and the months of occupational therapy that followed. Student loans deferred but not forgiven. Rent that did not care about her circumstances. She had withdrawn from the nursing program. She had moved into a smaller apartment on the east side, a single room above a dry cleaning business, where the floor smelled faintly of chemical solvents and the window faced a cinder block wall. She had sold almost everything she owned except the Honda, which had been repaired by a mechanic friend who charged her only for parts. Then she had gotten back on the bike and started riding. Courier work suited her in ways she had not expected. The job did not require her to hear. It required her to be fast, reliable, and able to navigate. She had always been good at those things. What she had lost in auditory awareness, she had compensated for in visual acuity. She checked her mirrors more than any hearing rider ever would. She felt vibrations through the handlebars and the seat, reading the road through her hands and her body the way a sailor reads weather through the tension in a sail. She had rigged the bike with extra lighting and a sensor system that lit up a panel on her handlebars when sound levels around her spiked above a threshold, a crude but effective substitute for her ears. Around her neck on a lanyard, she wore a small rectangular whiteboard, roughly the size of a paperback book, with a black dry erase marker clipped to the side. On the back, in permanent marker, she had written deaf. On the front, she wrote and erased dozens of messages every day. It had become so natural to her that she barely noticed it anymore. The uncapping of the marker, the quick, sharp strokes of letters, the turn of the board toward whoever needed to read it. She had become fluent in the efficiency of written communication, the way a person becomes fluent in any language through necessity and repetition. She had also become exceptionally good at reading lips, not perfectly, not in every condition, and not at any great distance, but in the situations that mattered close range, good light. A person facing her directly, she could follow a conversation well enough to understand the emotional content, if not every precise word. She had learned to watch for the tension in a jaw, the micro expression around the eyes, the body language that preceded speech. She saw people more clearly now, she believed, than she ever had when she could hear them. On the night this story begins, Maya was 40 minutes into her shift when she picked up the Route 9 package. She was sitting in the parking lot of a Circle K on Speedway Boulevard, her helmet resting on the seat beside her, eating a granola bar and reviewing her queue on the Courier app. The app communicated entirely through text and visual interface, one of the reasons she had chosen this particular service over others. Her dispatcher, a man named Greg, who she had never met in person but communicated with via text throughout every shift, was reliable and usually precise with his timing estimates. The Route 9 package was listed as a business delivery to a warehouse on the southern edge of the city. Medical supplies, sealed container standard rate, plus a distance bonus for the late night run. $42 total. She accepted it. The pickup location was a commercial building near the airport, a low flat structure with fluorescent lights in the lobby that made everyone inside look slightly ill. She signed for the package on the app, strapped it to her rear rack, and pulled back out into the night. Route 9 southbound was quiet at this hour. The road cut through the industrial fringe of the city, past warehouses and equipment yards, and the dark hulks of parked semi-trucks before opening up into the long flat corridor that connected the southern suburbs. There were no neighborhoods here, no late night restaurants or gas stations, or the comfortable noise of urban life. There were sodium vapor lights on tall poles, casting orange circles on the pavement, and between those circles, stretches of complete darkness. Maya did not mind the dark. She had learned not to. She had been on Route 9 for about 6 minutes when she pulled into the delivery address and found it wrong. The warehouse at the listed number was shuttered chain link fence, padlocked, no lights in any window. She stopped the bike, checked the app, confirmed the address. Dark. Closed. She sent a text to Greg. No response. She waited 2 minutes. Then, she noticed across the street and slightly to the south, another parking area attached to a different building, a long, low structure with a few vehicles parked in the shadow at the far end. One of the vehicles was running. She could not hear the engine, but she could see the exhaust faint wisps of vapor curling upward in the cooler night air, and she could see the lights cut to parking, only casting just enough illumination to outline two figures standing near the driver's side door of a dark SUV. Maya was not curious about strangers in parking lots at midnight. That was one of the most basic rules of the job. You delivered the package. You got the signature. You left. Whatever was happening wherever you were was not your business. But her phone was in her hand, and she was still waiting for Greg to respond. And, without thinking, she zoomed in on the two figures across the street, simply because she was looking in that direction, and the habit of visual attention was deeply wired into her by now. The first figure was large, not tall exactly, but wide, with the kind of physical density that spoke of someone who had spent years doing demanding physical work. He wore dark clothing and was standing with his back mostly to her. The second figure was smaller, moving quickly, the body language of someone who wanted the transaction to be over. The smaller figure was handing something to the larger one, not a package, not a bag. A thick envelope, the kind associated in Maya's experience exclusively with formal documents or less formally with cash. She would have looked away. That was the thing she kept returning to afterward. She would have looked away. But just as she was pulling her eyes back to the app on her phone, a car turned off Route 9 and its headlights swept across the parking lot. And in that brief hard light, she saw the larger man clearly. She saw the set of his shoulders and the angle of his jaw and the glint of something metal on his belt. And, without making a conscious decision, she pressed the camera button. Her phone took 3 photos in rapid succession. Burst mode. She always kept it on burst mode because she used the camera constantly for navigation notes, for photographing addresses and package labels, for the 100 small visual tasks that had replaced auditory information in her life. 3 photos in maybe a second and a half, and then the car swept past and the parking lot went dark again. She looked down at the photos. The first was blurred by motion. The second was clear, painfully, dangerously clear. She could see the larger man in profile. She could see the metal at his belt was a badge of some kind. She could see the envelope in transit between the 2 sets of hands. She could see the license plate of the SUV and the logo of a private security company on the door panel. And she could see the face of the smaller man looking up and directly at the camera, looking directly at her. In the second it took her to process this, the man was already moving. She did not hear him shout. She saw his mouth open wide, the cords in his neck standing out the expression of someone issuing a command. He was pointing at her. The larger man turned. He saw her. He started walking toward his vehicle with a speed and purpose that had nothing casual about it. Maya did not think. She locked her phone, shoved it into the interior chest pocket of her jacket, zipped the pocket closed, put her helmet on, and kicked the Honda to life. The vibration of the engine traveled up through the frame and into her hands, familiar and steadying. She turned the bike around and pulled onto Route 9 northbound. In her mirror, she saw the headlights of the SUV come on. Full brightness. She rode. The Honda was not a fast bike. It was a middleweight commuter, adequate for city streets and short highway stretches not built for sustained high speed. But Maya knew Route 9 the way she knew her own apartment. She knew every surface change, every turn, every pothole that had never been repaired. She knew where the road narrowed under the overpass. She knew the cut through behind the equipment yard that put you on Drexel Road without going through the main intersection. She knew these things because she had ridden this route in daylight and dark summer heat and winter chill for 2 years. She knew them in her hands. The SUV was faster. She could see the headlights in her mirror closing. Not panicking, methodical, the way someone pursues when they are confident they will catch you and they want you to know it. She took the cut through. The SUV did not follow immediately. She came out on Drexel and turned west, putting distance and a row of warehouses between herself and the point where she had last seen the headlights. She rode for 3 more minutes before pulling into a recessed loading dock and killing the engine. She sent a text to Greg. Wrong address. Package undelivered. Need alternate instructions. She sent a second text. Ran into a situation, will explain. She waited 2 minutes. 5. Greg did not respond. That was unusual. Greg always responded. She was sitting in the dark, watching the entrance to the loading dock, when her phone screen lit up. Not a text from Greg. A number she did not recognize. She answered it through the Relay app that converted voice calls to text. There was a pause, and then the words appeared on her screen. You need to pull over and wait for me. This is a police matter. She stared at the words, then she typed back, show me your badge number so I can verify. Another pause. Then, this is not optional. She took a screenshot of the exchange and emailed it to herself. She sat for another 30 seconds, thinking clearly through each option the way her occupational therapist had taught her to think through unfamiliar situations in the early months after the accident. Identify what you know. Identify what you do not know. Act only on what you know. What she knew, the man had not sent a badge number. She pulled out onto the street and headed north. She was not running from the police. She was clear on that in her own mind. If this were legitimate law enforcement, there were procedures, there were official channels, there were ways to verify identity. She was prepared to cooperate with any officer who could demonstrate proper authority. What she was not prepared to do was comply with an unknown person in an unmarked vehicle who had been receiving a cash envelope when she photographed him. She reached into the brief stillness of a red light and reverse image searched the badge visible in the second photograph. The design did not match Tucson PD. It did not match the Pima County Sheriff. She found it in a 10-second search, a private security contractor operating in the Southwest. The company was called Voss Meridian Group. 3 principals were listed on its website. The first was Derek Voss, founder. The light changed. She rode. She had been northbound for less than 2 minutes when she saw him parked on the shoulder facing south, positioned so that his headlights would hit her head on as she came up the road. Simple and effective. The technique of someone with vehicle pursuit training. Park where you can see the target coming. Let the target come to you. She recognized the SUV by its silhouette. The door was opening. She had maybe 4 seconds to make a decision. She turned right onto a cross street heading east into the darker edges of the industrial district. He made the turn behind her. She saw the headlights. He was following at a steady distance, now patient, and that patience was more frightening than the earlier chase had been. It was the patience of someone who does not need to rush because he has already decided how this ends. The road curved south and began to rise on the approach to the Route 9 overpass. She knew this area, the overpass, the dry wash below. The place where 2 years ago her life had divided cleanly into before and after. She had ridden under this structure hundreds of times since then, because avoiding it would have meant allowing it a power over her she refused to grant. The road dipped under the overpass, and she was briefly in the concrete dark below the bridge. She came out the other side. The SUV was right behind her. She looked ahead. 2 lanes industrial zone concrete sound barrier on the right, chain link fence on the left. No turns. Nowhere to stop. The SUV came alongside her. She felt the wind displacement of a large vehicle moving at close range. She kept her eyes forward and her hands steady. She felt the tap on her left side, deliberate. The front corner of the SUV just touching her rear fender. Not enough to knock her down. Enough to communicate that he could. Then, he swung left, cut across in front of her, and stopped. She had no room. She hit the brakes with everything she had, and the Honda screamed and shuddered to a halt with the front wheel 3 feet from his bumper. The rear kicked sideways on the grit, and she fought it straight with her left foot dragging on the road. The SUV door opened. Derek Voss stepped out. He was larger than she had estimated from the photographs. He moved like a man who was entirely comfortable with the physical authority his size provided, someone who had been using it as a primary tool for a very long time. He walked to her bike without hurrying. He wore dark, tactical clothing and work boots and had the badge on his belt, but no visible firearm, which she noted. He stopped 6 feet from the front wheel of the Honda. He said something. She watched his lips in the orange spill of the sodium vapor lamp above them. He said, "Get off the bike." She lifted her whiteboard from the lanyard and uncapped the marker. She wrote in large, clear letters. She held it up. Show badge and department ID. Law requires both. He stared at the board. Something moved across his face that was not quite surprise and not quite anger, but something closer to recalibration. He had not expected the whiteboard. He had not expected her to make a written demand while sitting at the end of a braking skid in the middle of the night. He said something else. She caught the fragments. Does not matter. And, give me the phone, she wrote. Badge number, verify first. He took 2 steps forward. His hand reached out and grabbed the whiteboard. The lanyard jerked against the back of her neck. He yanked harder, and the lanyard broke, and the board was in his hand. He looked at it for a moment. Then he let it fall to the road. The marker rolled under the bike. She kept both hands on the handlebars. He was moving now, circling to her left, and she had to turn her head to track him. When she turned, she saw what she had been hoping to see. Another vehicle. 2. Long way back on Route 9, headlights moving northbound, moving fast. He reached down and grabbed her left arm above the elbow. She did not resist immediately. She looked at his face and watched his mouth very carefully. He was speaking in short bursts, the cadence of someone delivering instructions. She caught. Phone. And last chance. And then something she was certain of because his lips were close and the word was unmistakable. He said her name. He said Maya. She had not given him her name. She had not identified herself in any communication. He had used her name, which meant he had not followed her tonight because of an accidental photograph. He had known who she was before she arrived in that parking lot. She had been targeted, not stumbled upon. That realization landed in her chest like cold water poured from a height. He tightened his grip and said something else. She caught. Come with me. And she caught. Nobody is coming. He was wrong about that. She could see the headlights on Route 9, and she could feel something else, something she had learned to rely on in the absence of hearing. A vibration. Low and rhythmic, spreading through the road surface and into the tires of the Honda, and up through the frame and into the grips and into her palms. Not one vehicle, not 2. Something that had no equivalent in her previous experience of this road. Voss had not looked behind him. He was focused on her on the phone in her jacket. He had not learned what she had learned, which was to read the road through his hands. But Maya had been feeling it for several seconds now, and it was building a deep, sustained frequency that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the concrete below, from the sound barrier to her right, from the chain-link fence that was beginning barely to shiver. Voss finally stopped talking. He turned his head. He looked back down Route 9, on the crest of the incline, where the road rose before the overpass. Something was cresting. Not just headlights. A wall of them. dozens paired and close moving in tight formation. The vibration reached a frequency she felt not just in her hands, but in the plate of her sternum and the bones of her forearms. Voss let go of her arm. He stood very still, looking at the oncoming lights, and on his face was something she recognized immediately, because she had been living with a version of it herself for the past 20 minutes. It was the specific, clarifying expression of a man who has just understood that he is not in control of the situation he believed he was managing. The lead pair of headlights separated slightly, and through the gap she began to make out shapes. Chrome, leather, the low, wide silhouettes of heavy American motorcycles, ridden by men who sat straight-backed and unhurried, taking up both lanes with the absolute calm of people who have never needed to make room for anyone. 50 of them, moving as one, shaking the ground beneath her feet, coming directly toward her. They came down Route 9 like a slow tide of thunder. The formation was too wide, perfectly spaced, the discipline of riders who had covered thousands of miles together across every kind of terrain and weather. The headlights swept the road in overlapping arcs. The vibration Maya had felt through the frame of her Honda had become something total now, a full-body frequency that bypasses the ears entirely and communicates directly to something older and more fundamental in the nervous system. She felt it in her jaw. She felt it in the hollow of her chest. She felt it in the soles of her boots where they pressed against the foot pegs. Voss had taken 2 steps backward toward his SUV. He had not gotten in. He stood with his hand resting on the door frame, watching the convoy come, and his face had gone through several rapid changes in the few seconds since he first saw the lights. The recalibration she had seen when she held up the whiteboard had given way to something harder to manage. Not fear exactly. The guarded composure of a man who has spent years in situations of physical risk and knows how to handle his own adrenaline. But working against that discipline was the fundamental human response to being suddenly and completely outnumbered by people who have not yet said a word. The lead rider raised his left fist. Not urgently. The gesture was unhurried and authoritative. The motion of someone whose signals are always obeyed, because they have never needed to be repeated. Behind him in sequence, the throttles pulled back. She felt the deceleration, change the character of the vibration, dropping it in frequency, making it less uniform as 50 engines shifted down through their gears in a loose cascade. They rolled to a stop in a rough arc that enclosed the scene with the organic precision of water finding a low point. 2 columns split smoothly to either side of the road. The result was not a military formation. It was what happens when a large number of experienced riders with good situational awareness encounter something that requires them to stop. They stop. They assess. They do it without apparent communication beyond that single raised fist, and in the span of 20 seconds, the isolated road was transformed entirely. The lead rider killed his engine. One by one, in no particular order, but with a cumulative effect that landed like a held breath. Finally released, the engines around him went quiet. The stillness that replaced them was not empty. It had weight and texture and the particular quality of attention that comes from 50 people choosing simultaneously and deliberately to say nothing and watch everything. The only movement was steam rising from exhaust pipes in the cool desert air and the slight forward lean of riders whose bodies communicated interest without aggression. The lead rider swung his leg over the bike and stood. He was a large man, broader through the chest and shoulders than Voss, though not quite as tall. He wore a leather vest over a dark flannel shirt, the vest carrying patches she could not read from this distance. His hair was gray and cropped short, and he had a close-trimmed gray beard. He moved with the deliberateness of a man who had made his decision 3 steps ago, and saw no reason to hurry the arrival of it. He walked toward her, not toward Voss, toward her. Maya kept both hands on the handlebars. She watched him come. She was reading everything she could: the angle of his shoulders, the position of his hands, the quality of attention in his face. His hands were empty and relaxed at his sides. His face was serious, without being aggressive. He was looking at her with an expression she could only describe as careful. The expression of someone who recognizes a situation as fragile and is choosing his movements accordingly. He stopped at the front wheel of the Honda. He looked at her face. Then his gaze moved systematically, taking in the broken lanyard at her collar, the torn left sleeve of her jacket, where Voss had grabbed her, the absence of the whiteboard. His eyes stopped at her left wrist, where the cuff of her jacket had ridden up during the struggle. She wore a braided leather cord, there brown and worn. Beneath it, visible at the edge, was the upper margin of a scar. Pale and thin, the remnant of a surgical incision. Road debris. They had picked 6 pieces of gravel out of her left forearm in the emergency room 3 years ago. The man looked at the scar for 2 full seconds. Then he looked up at her face. Something happened in his expression. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. A subtle interior movement, the kind that surfaces only when a person is not actively managing their face, when something genuinely unexpected has occurred inside them. His eyes changed. They were brown steady, and they changed the way a room changes when someone opens a window. He reached up and removed his sunglasses. He folded them carefully and slipped them into his vest pocket. He looked at her, directly, taking care to face her squarely in the available light, and she understood from that small adjustment that someone had told him, or he had seen for himself, that she was deaf. He was making himself readable. He said something slowly and clearly. He said, "Route 9, 3 years ago." She did not move. He touched the left side of his own chest. Then he pointed gently at the scar on her wrist. He said, "I was the one who stopped." The world did not shift dramatically when this happened. There was no sudden clarity from the sky. She was sitting on her motorcycle on a road she had returned to hundreds of times on purpose, and a man she had never consciously seen was telling her that she had seen him in a version of this night 3 years ago that she carried in her body, but not in her memory, because she had been unconscious when it mattered most. She had been told in the hospital that a motorcyclist had seen the crash, stopped, called 911, and stayed until the paramedics arrived. She had been told he had used his own riding jacket to keep her warm and had held her hand when she went into shock. She had been told his name was never recorded because he had left before the official report was filed. She had thought about him occasionally over the 2 years since the anonymous stranger, and she had not been able to attach a face to him because she had no memory of a face. The man standing in front of her now was that face. She became aware that she was gripping the handlebars harder than necessary. She made herself loosen her fingers. She reached into the breast pocket of her jacket and pulled out the backup marker she always kept there. She looked at her left forearm, at the pale skin above the cuff. She uncapped the marker and wrote on her own arm, large and clear, "You stayed with me." She held out her arm toward him. He read it. He nodded once, slow and certain. She wrote beneath the first line, "I lost my hearing in that crash." He looked at the words for a moment. Then he looked at her face. He said something short, and she caught every word, because he had already learned how to be read. He said, I know. I found out after. She felt the thing that comes after sustained adrenaline, the sudden permeability of defenses that had been held in place by necessity. She pressed her lips together and held herself together and wrote one more line on her arm. Who are you? He said his name clearly, facing her directly. Ray Decker. Behind her, she was peripherally aware of movement. The organized, purposeful movement of people who have been patient long enough and have decided it is time to be useful. Two riders had dismounted and positioned themselves near Voss, not touching him, simply standing near him in the way that large, calm, watchful men can stand near a person and communicate everything necessary without words. Voss had not moved from his position by the door. He was looking at the two men nearest him, and then at the broader ring of riders, and doing, she suspected, the same mathematics she had done a short time ago regarding roads and exits and the available options. The math was not resolving in his favor. A third rider came to her left side and crouched down to examine her torn sleeve. He was older, with a gray mustache that covered his upper lip entirely, and eyes that assessed the situation with professional efficiency. He had a bag. He unzipped it without asking permission, and she saw the organized interior of a medical kit, the kind carried by someone with actual training, rather than someone who bought a ready-made box at a drugstore. He looked up at her and read his own lips first, making sure he was facing her clearly. He said, My name is Dutch, former EMT. Can I look at your arm? She nodded. Ray had turned from her and walked toward Voss. She tracked the conversation from this angle, reading what she could. The lip reading was partial, given the light and distance, but she caught the word badge and the phrase, not a peace officer, and the name Voss Meridian, which Ray apparently already knew, which was its own piece of information worth holding. Voss was talking with the modulated reasonableness of a man who believes he can still negotiate his way to a better position. He was not shouting. He was presenting what she assumed was some version of justification. Ray listened to all of it with the patience of a man who had already decided that what he was about to say was not going to change regardless of what he heard. Then Ray said something brief. She read only 2 words, but they were enough. He said, not leaving. Dutch finished cleaning the abrasion where Voss had grabbed her, and the jacket edge had cut into the skin. He taped a small piece of gauze over it with the efficient economy of someone for whom this was not an extraordinary situation. Then he looked up. He said, You have glass in your hair from the mirror. Can I? She nodded. He picked 2 small pieces of tempered glass from the right side of her hair and showed them to her on his palm before disposing of them. Then he looked at her with the direct, unpatronizing attention of someone who has spent a career meeting people in bad situations exactly where they are. She pulled out her phone. She navigated to the photos. She showed Dutch the clear one, the second shot Voss in profile, and the smaller man looking directly at the camera. Dutch looked at it for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. He stood and said one word over his shoulder, and Ray came back. She held the phone out to Ray. He took it in both hands. He looked at the photo. He enlarged it with 2 fingers, moving slowly to the face of the smaller man in the background. He held the phone at an angle that kept the screen away from Voss. He looked at the enlarged image for 5 full seconds. Then he looked at Voss, then back at the phone, then at her. He said something carefully, making sure every word was readable. He said, "Do you know who this is?" "The second man." She shook her head. Ray said, "His name is Gerald Pruitt. He is the deputy director of the Tucson Police Department." She looked at the photo, at the face of the man who had been handing an envelope to Derek Voss in a dark parking lot and who had looked up at exactly the wrong moment and seen her camera. This was not a single corrupt operator running a side business. This was something that reached into the official structure of city law enforcement, which meant that the tools she would normally reach for when threatened by someone claiming authority were not necessarily safe to reach for. She wrote on her arm below the previous lines, "That is why he knew my name before tonight." Ray read it. He nodded. She wrote, "He was following me before I took the photo," Ray said. "How long?" She shook her head. She did not know. She wrote, "Greg, my dispatcher stopped responding tonight. First time in 2 years." Ray looked at that. He turned and said something to Dutch. Dutch moved away, pulling out a phone. She watched the group of riders around Voss. There were 4 of them now, positioned at loose intervals. Not physical restraint. Social restraint. He was not going anywhere without making a scene that the assembled company would witness. And he was apparently smart enough to understand that making that scene in front of this many people with the evidence she held on her phone was not a calculation that resolved in his favor. One of the 4 riders near Voss had been in her peripheral awareness since the convoy stopped. He was younger than most mid-30s, with a shaved head and the compact energy of someone who is always slightly ahead of the current moment. She had noticed him for 2 reasons. The first was that he had positioned himself closest to Voss from the moment the convoy stopped, which read either as protective instinct toward the group or personal interest in the situation. The second was that she had seen him about 3 minutes after the convoy stopped take out his phone and type something low at his side, the way people type when they do not want the motion noticed. She had not mentioned it. She was watching. He typed again now. Short message. Sent quickly. Phone returned to pocket. His face stayed neutral, but the rhythm of the typing was purposeful. Not a social text. An operational one. She filed it and continued watching. A heavy-set rider in his late 40s came and stood near her. He had a broad, weathered face and the direct, economical manner of someone who has done a lot of things in his life that required him to be efficient with people. He pointed to himself. She read his lips. Curtis. He said, "Ray asked me to stay with you." She held up one finger. She pointed at the man with the shaved head near Voss. She wrote on the back of her hand, 3 texts in 15 minutes. Who is he? Curtis looked at the man. His expression shifted carefully. He said a name. She read it. Colt. She wrote, "Is that normal during a stop?" Curtis looked at Colt again longer this time. He said, "No." She wrote, "I need Ray." Curtis walked to Ray without further conversation, which she appreciated. He leaned in and said something quietly. Ray did not look immediately at Colt. He continued with Voss for a few more seconds, completing whatever exchange was in progress. And then he turned his head in a direction that brought Colt into peripheral view without making the attention direct or obvious. Voss noticed the shift. Something crossed his face, not fear. Rapid calculation. She watched Colt. He was not looking at his phone now. He was watching Ray with the contained alertness of someone waiting for an outcome he has a stake in. Ray walked toward Colt. He covered the distance between them the way you cross a room in your own house, purposeful without urgency. He stopped beside Colt and said something quietly in profile to her, and she lost most of the words. What she did not lose was the quality of Colt's response. The coiled energy she had noticed earlier became something less controlled. The slight reorientation of weight that precedes a decision about direction. Ray held out his hand. The gesture needed no translation. He was asking for the phone. Colt said something. She read fragments, misunderstanding and mine, and just checking. Ray did not move his outstretched hand. Colt looked at the hand. He looked at the riders around him. The semicircle of the group, none of whom had moved, but all of whom were now oriented toward this small exchange with the particular attentiveness of people who have been part of an organization long enough to recognize when something important is happening inside it. He looked at Dutch. He looked at Curtis. He looked at the assembled weight of a brotherhood he had apparently underestimated. He put the phone in Ray's hand. Ray looked at the screen for 10 seconds without expression. Then he raised his head and looked at Colt and said something short. Dutch moved immediately to Colt's side. Two other riders closed in from the far side, not touching him, simply being present, definitively, in the way the whole group had been present around Voss. Colt stood very still. He looked at the ground. Ray walked back to her. He held the phone at an angle she could see. The last message Colt had sent was still on the screen. The number it was addressed to was not saved under a name, but the content was unambiguous. The message read, "She has photos. Decker has seen them. Pruitt is in one of them." She looked at Ray. He looked at her. She wrote on the back of her second hand. "I knew. I read his lips on the first text. I waited to see how many he would send." Ray read it. He looked at her face for a moment. Then he said something she caught completely because he made certain she would. He said, "You waited." She nodded. He said, "Why?" She found a remaining space on the inside of her forearm and wrote small and careful. Needed to know how far it went. He looked at that. He looked at Colt standing in the loose circle of his former brothers, with his eyes still down. He looked at Voss, who had seen the exchange with Colt, and whose face had completed its journey from calculation through recalibration, and arrived finally at something that looked like the first honest emotion he had shown all night. It was not complicated. It was the expression of a man who has just watched his last exit close and understood clearly that he closed it himself. Ray looked back at her. He said, "Here's what happens next." She held up a hand. He stopped. She took out her phone. She looked at the clear photo one last time, Voss in profile, and Pruitt's face turned directly toward the lens with an expression that would tell any investigator exactly what they needed to know about whether the man understood he was doing something wrong. She forwarded the photo to her own email. She forwarded it to a cloud backup she used for work records. She sent a copy to her own number via text, which would create a timestamp server record. She did all of this in 45 seconds, with her hands completely steady. Then, she opened a federal tip line app she had downloaded 8 months ago after reading a story about courier networks being used for distribution. She had downloaded it quietly, the way you do something you hope you never need. She had opened it twice to confirm it still worked, and had not used it since. She composed a message. She attached the photo. She attached the screenshot of the unknown number exchange from earlier in the night. She attached a screenshot of Colt's outgoing message. She sent it. Then she looked up at Ray and held out both arms so he could read everything she had written across them from the beginning of the night forward. The full record of what she had seen and done and decided pressed into her own skin. He read it all slowly from the first badge demand to the last lines. When he finished, he looked at her face. He said, "You already sent it." She nodded. He said one more thing, and she read it without difficulty. He said, "Good girl." She shook her head. She found the last available space on the back of her right thumb and wrote 2 words. Good woman. Ray looked at it. For the first time since he had walked across the road toward her, something that had been held carefully in place moved into something warmer. Not quite a smile. The honest precondition of one. He turned back toward the road. In the near distance where Route 9 met the cross street, a pair of headlights appeared. The steady, deliberate progress of something that had found its destination. Ray saw it. Voss saw it. Voss's body changed a slight forward lean, the reorientation of someone who is either about to be relieved or about to find himself in a considerably more complicated position. A uniformed officer stepped out of the cruiser. He was in his late 30s, medium build, with the specific wariness of a patrol officer who has arrived at a scene that resembles nothing he was dispatched to handle. His hand dropped to his hip, not drawing, just resting. He looked at the assembled motorcycles and at Voss by his door and at the circle around Colt and at Dutch's open medical bag and at the broken whiteboard on the road and at Maya sitting on her Honda with a marker in her hand and the names of dangerous men written across both arms. Ray stepped forward with both hands visible, resting on his belt. He said, "Afternoon, officer. Nobody's looking for trouble. We are making sure this gentleman does not leave the scene of a crime." The officer whose nameplate read Reyes approached carefully. He looked at the SUV. He looked at the physical evidence on the road. He looked at Maya. She held up her phone so he could see the second photograph clearly. She held it steady and let him take his time with it. He looked at the image for a long moment, then he looked at the face of the smaller man in the background and said a name aloud. She read it off his lips with complete clarity. He said, "Pruitt." He said it the way you say a name when things you have known separately are suddenly assembling into a shape you have been reluctant to examine directly. She nodded. Reyes looked at Ray. He looked at Voss. He looked at Colt in his circle. He reached for his radio and called for a supervisor and 2 additional units giving his location. He did not say over the open channel why he needed them, and she noted that omission and understood its meaning. While he waited, he came to her. He stopped at a respectful distance and faced her directly, which she appreciated. He looked at the writing on her arms and then at the marker, and then he made a simple, clear gesture that meant he wanted to read what was there. She held out both arms. He read from her right wrist upward, and then crossed to her left arm and read downward to the scar and the lines above it. He took out a notebook and copied several phrases into it. The badge demand, the Voss Meridian identification, the dispatcher detail, the Pruitt identification. He did it methodically and without visible reaction. Then he looked up and spoke clearly, with his face turned fully toward her. He said, "I am Officer Daniel Reyes. I need you to stay here and not send anything further until I can get a federal contact on the phone. Can you do that?" She showed him the tip line submission. Sent timestamp, 40 minutes prior. He looked at it. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he looked at her again and said, "That may actually be better." He went to Voss. She watched the conversation, reading what she could. Voss had shifted from calculation to the defended posture of a man waiting for a lawyer. He answered in short sentences with the flat compliance of someone who has made a decision to say as little as possible and intends to hold to it. Reyes came back. He said, "Additional units in 7 minutes. Supervisor en route." He said, "The tip line submission will have flagged already. There will be a duty agent who sees it tonight." He paused and said something she caught completely. He said, "That was smart." She wrote on the pad he had given her earlier, "I have been preparing for something like this for a year without knowing it." He nodded once without asking her to explain. 20 minutes after Reyes arrived, a third vehicle came down Route 9 moving slowly. The hesitation of a driver who has seen the police lights and is calculating. It pulled to the shoulder 40 yards back. The door opened. The man who stepped out wore civilian clothing. Dark jacket, no visible badge. Walsh, the supervisor, who had arrived 10 minutes prior, saw him and went very still, in the specific way of someone who has just recognized an unexpected variable. Ray saw Walsh go still and turned to look. Maya did not know the face until Ray stepped close and turned toward her carefully. He said, "That is Pruitt. He came to see what was left to manage." Walsh was already moving. He covered the distance between himself and Pruitt with the long-legged stride of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment and is not going to allow any additional distance to develop. She watched the encounter from where she sat. Pruitt saw Walsh coming, and his body did something that was not quite stopping and not quite retreating. The particular freeze of a person who has arrived at a situation they believe they understood and has just discovered they understood it completely wrong. Walsh spoke to Pruitt for 30 seconds. Then he gestured to one of the additional officers who had arrived with the backup units. Pruitt looked at the officer. He looked back at Walsh. He looked finally across the road to where Maya sat on her Honda with the phone in her hand, and she saw him see the phone, and she watched his face understand what was on it, and she watched the last calculation he would make on this road resolve into the only conclusion it had left. He put his hands out in front of him, wrists together, and waited. She looked away. She did not need to watch the rest of that. Dutch came to her while the scene was still being processed. He stood at her side the way he had stood at the edge of the road when this began, and he said, "You did good tonight." She wrote on the legal pad Reyes had given her, "You kept the glass out of my hair." He said, "That is what I do." He pulled on his gloves. He said, 9 a.m. Do not be late." She wrote, "I am never late." He nodded once and walked back to his bike. Voss was formally detained at 12:47. She saw it from where she sat, Reyes and a second officer approaching the brief exchange, the hands going to the back. Voss went through it with the mechanical compliance of a man who is already inside his own head, constructing the next phase, and has no attention left for emotional response to this one. Colt was detained 10 minutes later. He did not look up when it happened. He stood with his wrists together and his face carrying an expression she could not fully read at this distance. Something that was not defiance and not quite remorse, but the specific expression of a person who made a choice that felt reasonable at the time and is now understanding clearly that it was not. She watched Ray watch Colt being detained. She could not see Ray's face from this angle, but she could see the set of his back and shoulders, the careful stillness of a large man holding himself very precisely in place. Dutch came and stood beside Ray without touching him or speaking, and that proximity seemed sufficient for whatever the moment required. She looked down at the legal pad on her knee, at the 20 minutes of testimony covering both sides of 4 pages, at her own handwriting moving across the lines in the particular compressed clarity of someone who has been writing quickly and cannot waste a word. She thought about Greg. She pulled out her phone and texted him. I am okay. A lot happened tonight. I will explain tomorrow. I. 3 minutes later, her phone lit up. She read it and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. He wrote, Lost signal for an hour. Tower issue at Drexel and Ninth. Are you okay? She sat with that for a moment, the Drexel and Ninth Tower. She knew exactly where that was. She had ridden past it 40 minutes ago with Voss 3 car lengths behind her. A service outage at that location at that hour on this night was either the most useful coincidence of her life or something she would never be able to prove was not a coincidence. She filed it in the category of things to consider later when the immediate work of the night was done. She wrote back, I am okay. Then, save your signal logs from tonight. He responded, already doing it, sometime after 1 a.m, with the scene controlled and the detainees in separate vehicles, and Walsh coordinating up his chain of command. Ray walked back to her. He sat on his motorcycle beside hers. They were at the same height and facing the same direction, which felt like the right arrangement. She looked at him. She held up the pen she had been using for the legal pad. He reached into the interior pocket of his vest. He took out an envelope. Standard white business envelope, folded once slightly worn at the crease in the way of something carried for a long time. He held it out to her. She took it. Her name was on the front in handwriting she did not recognize, neat and deliberate. She looked at Ray. He said, Open it. Inside was a single document, 3 pages printed on hospital billing letterhead. She unfolded it. At the top of the first page was her name, her admission date, her account number. At the bottom of the first page was a balance. $61,240. The second page was a payment confirmation. Full balance paid. Date of payment 3 years ago, 14 days after her admission date. Payer name, Raymond T. Decker. The third page was a letter. Short, unsigned, printed in the same careful hand as her name on the envelope. It said, You do not know me. I was on Route 9 the night of your accident. I stayed until the paramedics came. I found out later about the bills and the hearing loss and the school you had to leave. I am not telling you this because I want anything from you. I am telling you because the debt is gone, and you should stop working so hard in the dark to pay something that no longer exists. You are going to be okay. She read it twice. She read the payment date. She looked at the billing letterhead and the account number that matched the paperwork she had been carrying in her own files for 2 years. The statement she checked every few months to calculate how much she had paid down and how much remained. She looked at Ray. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has been carrying something for 3 years and has just set it down and is feeling the weight leave his shoulders for the first time. She picked up the pen. She held it over the legal pad. There were things she wanted to write that she could not find the right sequence for. The gratitude and the anger at not knowing, and the strange, complicated relief of understanding that a burden she had been carrying was lifted 3 years ago without her knowledge. She wanted to write about 2 years of night shifts and granola bars in parking lots and the apartment with the cinder block view, about what it does to you to bend toward a debt in the dark and not be able to see the bottom of it. She wrote, "You paid it 3 years ago and let me work anyway." He read it. He said, "I did not know how to find you, and when I might have found a way, you had already built something. The writing, the work, the way you move through the city. I did not want to make that about me." She wrote, "It would not have been about you," he said. "I know that now." She looked at the letter, at her name written carefully on the outside of the envelope, at the payment date, 14 days after the worst Tuesday of her life. She wrote, "You could not save my hearing," he said. "No." She wrote, "But you stayed on the road." He looked at her. He said, "Yes." He said, "That was the only thing I knew how to do that night." She nodded. She folded the letter and the billing statement carefully along their original creases and returned them to the envelope. She placed the envelope in the interior chest pocket of her jacket, zipped it closed, and pressed her hand flat against it for a moment from the outside. Walsh came back at 1:38 with information delivered in the careful language of someone who has been on the radio with people above his authority level and is conveying exactly what he has been authorized to convey. A duty agent from the Phoenix field office of the FBI had been reached. The tip line submission had been flagged and was under review. 2 agents would be at the Tucson field office by early morning. Maya's presence was requested at that location at 9 a.m. The evidence on her phone was to be preserved. He handed her a card with a case number and the name of an agent named Carver. She put the card in the same pocket as the envelope. Walsh said, "What you did tonight, the documentation, the tip line, the way you managed the scene before we arrived, that is going to matter in how far this goes." She wrote on the pad, "I want to make sure it goes far enough," he said. "That is what 9 a.m. is for." He went to his vehicle. The scene cleared gradually after that. The additional units departed. The SUV was tagged for impound. The road that had been transformed by the arrival of 50 motorcycles was returning slowly to its ordinary dimensions. Ray came back to her for the last time. He stood beside her motorcycle and looked down Route 9 toward the overpass. She followed his gaze. The structure was there in the middle distance, concrete and functional, indifferent to the things that had happened at its margin. The dry wash below was invisible in the dark, a void you could only know was there if you already knew to look for it. He said, "Can you make it home from here?" She looked at him. She wrote on the last clean space remaining on the legal pad, "I have been making it home from here for 2 years." He read it. He said, "Yes, you have." He paused. He said, "I would like to make sure you get there tonight." She looked at the assembled riders on the shoulder of the road. She looked at the overpass. She looked at the sky above Tucson, the deep indigo of desert sky past midnight, the stars bright and numerous in the way they only are when you are far enough from the concentrated lights of the city center. She nodded. Ray raised his arm. The signal traveled down the line of riders with the same organic efficiency she had seen when they stopped. One person responding to the person ahead, information moving the length of the group in a wave. Engines started, not all at once, in sequence. The vibration built from one end of the formation to the other, and By the time it reached the last rider, it had become the thing she had felt through the road 2 hours ago. That deep, sustained frequency that communicates presence and purpose without a single word. She put on her helmet, she checked her mirrors, she started the Honda and felt its engine join the larger frequency around her, a small, consistent note in a chord of 50. The formation organized itself. 2 riders moved ahead of her, taking the northbound lead. On her left, 4 riders pulled alongside at spacing that was close enough to be deliberate and far enough to give her room. On her right, the same. She looked in her mirror. Ray Decker was directly behind her, one bike length back. His headlights steady and unwavering. She looked forward. She looked. The overpass was ahead. A quarter mile. She had ridden under it in rain and heat, and the cold blue mornings of January, and the blinding afternoons of July. She had ridden under it alone every time, because she had always been alone on this road. The idea of it, the before and the after, the silence that had begun in its shadow, had been something she carried the way you carry a stone in your shoe. Present always. Working against you in ways you adapted to without fully acknowledging. She rode toward it. The vibration of 50 engines moved through the road, and through her tires, and through the frame, and into her hands and her chest and the bones of her forearms. She felt it the way she felt everything now, completely. And, without mediation, the physical world translated directly into sensation. Because the auditory layer between sensation and meaning had been removed, and she had learned over 2 years to read without it. She went under the overpass, concrete on both sides, for 3 seconds. The headlights of the formation lit the underside of the bridge. She looked up for a fraction of a second at the ceiling of it, at the seam where the lanes divided overhead. She came out the other side. The road opened ahead north toward the city lights. The formation moved with her. She looked in her mirror at Ray, behind her steady, and beyond him at the long line of headlights stretching back down Route 9, and the overpass growing smaller behind them, all losing proportion, becoming what it had always actually been. A structure on a road she knew how to ride. The city grew closer. The industrial dark gave way to the first scattered lights of the eastern neighborhoods. The air was cooler now, the deep of the night, the hour when the desert gives back what the day took. She rode with both hands on the bars and her eyes forward. She felt Ray behind her and the formation around her and the road under her tires and the envelope in her chest pocket against her sternum. And she felt the thing that happens when a night that has demanded everything from you finally begins to release its hold. She thought about 9 a.m. and Agent Carver in the photograph on her phone and the chain of events it would set in motion. She thought about Voss in a cruiser and Colt in a separate one and Gerald Pruitt with his hands extended and wrists together, waiting, understanding at last what waiting felt like from the other side of it. She thought about the legal pad in her bag and the testimony written across 4 pages, and the things she had written on her own skin, and the fact that she had built 2 years of nights on top of a foundation she had not known was already solid. The foundation was solid. It had always been solid. The work she had done on top of it was entirely her own. She came off Route 9 and into her neighborhood. The formation adjusted to the narrower streets with ease. She passed the corner store. She passed the equipment yard. She turned right at her intersection. Her building was ahead. The light above the side door was on yellow and slightly unsteady, the bulb she had been meaning to report to the landlord for 3 months. She pulled into her spot in the narrow lot beside the dry cleaning business and stopped the Honda and put down the stand. She sat for a moment with her hands on the bars. Around her, the formation settled. Not in her lot. They lined the street. Some pulled to the curb. Some held their positions in the road. The engines went quiet one by one in their familiar sequence until the street was still and the overhead bulb was the only thing moving, its unsteady yellow light casting a small warm circle over her door. She took off her helmet. She got off the bike. She stood in the parking lot and looked at the street, full of motorcycles and the men on them. And Ray Decker parked at the front of the line with his hands on his thighs, watching her. She looked at her arms. The ink was fully dry. In the parking lot light, she could read it all, the full record of the night written across her own skin. She would wash it off in the morning, before 9 a.m., before Carver. She would wash it off and put on clean clothes and walk into the federal building and give them everything they needed to do what needed to be done. But right now, she looked at it. She thought about silence, about what it actually was and what it was not. She had spent 2 years thinking of it as the defining condition of her life. Now, the loss around which everything else had been reorganized. She had thought of it as an absence. Standing in the parking lot, she understood something she had been working toward for a long time without having the occasion to complete the thought. Silence was not an absence. It was a frequency. The particular vibration of the world received through channels other than the ones you started with. She had been receiving it for 2 years through her hands and her eyes and the soles of her feet, and she had been calling it a limitation. It was not a limitation. It was a language. She had become fluent in it. She had used it tonight on a road that had taken something from her to see things that people who could hear had entirely missed. She had read the lips of a man making covert calls at the edge of a crowd. She had felt the approach of 50 motorcycles through the asphalt before anyone else registered they were coming. She had seen the face of a corrupt official in 3 photographs taken in a second and a half in the dark. And she had known immediately what she was looking at and what it meant and what she needed to do. And what? She uncapped the marker one last time. She looked at her left palm, the only surface she had not written on. She wrote 2 words. Not a demand, not evidence, not a message for anyone else. She wrote, "Still here." She looked at it for a moment, then she capped the marker and put it in her pocket and walked to the door of her building. Behind her, one engine started, then another, then the rest in their sequential way, each one joining the frequency until the street was full of it, the deep sustained vibration traveling through the asphalt and through the concrete foundation of the building and up through the floor and into the soles of her feet as she climbed the stairs. She felt it with every step. She was still feeling it when she reached her door, and she stood there for a moment with her hand on the frame and the vibration moving through the building around her and the night settling into whatever it becomes after everything necessary has been done. Then she went inside.